Number 10. The Order of the Dragon. Some secret societies became famous because of what they did. Others became famous because of what later generations imagined they must have been. The Order of the Dragon exists in that uneasy space between documented power and expanding legend, which is exactly why it belongs on this list. Founded in 1408 by Sigismund of Luxembourg, who would later become Holy Roman Emperor, the Order of the Dragon was not originally a fantasy society hiding in the shadows for its own sake. It was a chivalric order created in a very real political world shaped by dynastic struggle, frontier warfare, Christian kingship, and the growing pressure of the Ottoman advance into Europe. On paper, its function was relatively clear: to defend the Christian order, protect the crown, and bind key nobles more tightly to a network of loyalty centered on Sigismund's authority. That alone would make it historically significant. But the reason it remains so intriguing is that orders like this never stay confined to their founding paperwork. Once ritual symbols, elite membership, and oath-bound association enter the picture, the organization begins to radiate meanings far beyond its administrative purpose. The dragon emblem itself carried extraordinary symbolic weight, suggesting not just prestige, but a kind of militant, sacred identity. Membership marked inclusion in an intimate circle of trust and seriousness, the kind of inner structure rulers often need when ordinary political loyalty is too unstable to rely on by itself. That is where the deeper mystery begins. Because the Order of the Dragon was both visible and obscure at once. We know it existed. We know powerful nobles were connected to it. We know it functioned inside a Europe where warfare, piety, dynastic competition, and symbolic legitimacy were tightly fused. But beyond that, it becomes harder to see clearly. How much did the order truly matter as an operational force? How much was it a tool of political cohesion? How much did its symbolism exceed its practical reach? These are the kinds of questions that secretive or semi-secret elite bodies always generate. They leave behind names, emblems, associations, and traces of ceremony, but not always a transparent map of their actual influence. And then there is the shadow cast by later legend. The most famous figure linked indirectly to the order's symbolic afterlife is Vlad II, father of Vlad III, better known as Vlad the Impaler. Vlad II was inducted into the order and became known as Vlad Dracul, from the dragon symbol associated with it. That linguistic and symbolic connection helped drag the order into a much darker zone of memory, where political brotherhood, dynastic violence, frontier war, and later vampire mythology all begin to blur at the edges. The order itself did not create the Dracula legend in the modern pop cultural sense, but it became entangled with one of Europe's most enduring dark historical mythologies. That entanglement matters, because it shows how secretive orders often survive not only through archives, but through symbolic contamination. Their real functions become mixed with later fears, literary invention, and retrospective fantasy. The Order of the Dragon was a concrete institution of power, but it also became part of a broader imaginative world in which elite brotherhoods seem always on the edge of hidden purpose. Once that happens, the historical group becomes difficult to isolate from the aura around it. That is why history still cannot fully see through it. Not because the order is wholly unknown, but because it occupies that classic hidden archives territory where documented structure meets expanding myth. It was real enough to matter, symbolic enough to attract projection, and close enough to violence and dynastic power to remain permanently charged. We can identify its founders and members. We can trace its place in a specific political crisis. But we still feel that there was something more inside it than any list of names can capture. Some inner logic of allegiance, ambition, and symbolic force that does not fully survive in the record. And perhaps that is the real lesson of the Order of the Dragon. Many secretive brotherhoods do not remain mysterious because nothing is known about them. They remain mysterious because what is known is just enough to reveal the outer shell, while the emotional reality of belonging to the circle disappears. The insignia survives. The charter survives. The rumors survive. The atmosphere survives. The interior does not. And once that interior is gone, secrecy keeps doing its work long after the order itself has faded. Number 9. The Carbonari. Some secret societies hide behind ancient symbols, religious language, or aristocratic ritual. The Carbonari are more unsettling because they emerge from a more modern kind of darkness. The darkness of political conspiracy, coded organization, and revolution moving beneath the surface of states that appeared outwardly stable. Active especially in early 19th century Italy, the Carbonari were not a single, perfectly unified master organization in the way later conspiracy fantasies often prefer. They were more diffuse, more networked, and in some ways more historically elusive than that. But they were real, influential, and deeply tied to the atmosphere of underground politics that shaped post-Napoleonic Europe. Their name, often linked to charcoal burners, already carried the suggestive quality that secret movements so often possess: humble on the surface, hidden fire underneath. That image suited them perfectly. The Carbonari operated through secrecy, initiation, signs, internal ranks, and ideological commitment. They were associated with liberal, constitutional, and nationalist causes in a Europe where monarchies and restored regimes feared hidden organization for very good reason. This was an age when public dissent could be dangerous, when censorship and surveillance pressed political movements underground, and when the boundary between patriot, reformer, conspirator, and rebel was dangerously thin. In that world, secrecy was not merely theatrical, it was practical. It was survival. And that practicality is part of what makes the Carbonari so difficult to fully see through now. Because unlike some orders that were designed around ceremonial prestige, the Carbonari existed within living political struggle. Their secrecy was tied not just to mystique, but to action. Insurrectionary hopes, covert cells, coded communication, and the dream of reshaping political life all moved through the name. They were linked to revolutionary agitation in parts of Italy and beyond, and their influence reached enough prominent figures to ensure that governments took them seriously. Fear of secret political brotherhoods was not entirely paranoid in this case. Something was happening in the dark. But exactly how much was happening is harder to fix. That is where the historical haze thickens. The Carbonari are one of those groups whose real importance is undeniable, yet whose full structure remains difficult to pin down because secrecy itself fragmented the evidence. Local variations, overlapping membership, informants, state repression, myth-making by enemies, and self-mythologizing by participants all complicate the picture. Secret societies are rarely preserved in neat institutional clarity. They survive in testimonies, police records, memoirs, accusations, symbolic traces, and half-lit political memory. The Carbonari are almost a perfect example of that problem, and the timing made them even more potent. They operated in a Europe trembling between restoration and revolution. Old dynastic systems were trying to reassert order after the Napoleonic upheaval, but nationalism, liberal constitutionalism, and modern political aspiration had already entered the bloodstream. That meant the Carbonari became more than just one hidden association. They became a symbol of the possibility that the future itself might be organizing in secret under the feet of governments who still imagined control belonged entirely to them. That is an extraordinarily dangerous aura for any group to possess, because once a secret political society becomes the embodiment of submerged change, it starts to outgrow the factual limits of its own membership. It becomes larger in fear than in numbers, larger in legend than in documents. Governments exaggerate it, admirers romanticize it. Later generations absorb it as a sign that history is sometimes moved less by speeches in the open than by vows taken in locked rooms. Whether that exaggerates the Carbonari or not, It explains why they remain so magnetically obscure. They stand at the threshold of modern conspiracy culture without being reducible to fantasy. That is what makes them so compelling. The Carbonari were not merely imagined puppet masters, but neither can they be cleanly reduced to a simple reform club with dramatic rituals. They belong to that unstable category where secrecy, genuine political ambition, and historical myth feed each other. The more authorities feared them, the larger they seemed. The larger they seemed, the more the romance of hidden brotherhood attached itself to their name. Over time, the group became one of those recurring proofs that modern politics has always had an underground dimension, one made of codes, trust, danger, and the constant possibility of betrayal. And that is why history still cannot fully see through them. Not because they are totally lost, but because they were built in exactly the kind of environment that produces permanent interpretive fog. Too secret for simplicity, too real for dismissal, too politically charged to remain neutral in memory. The Carbonari survive not just as a revolutionary brotherhood, but as a reminder that hidden networks often become most powerful in the historical imagination precisely when the archive can no longer hold them still. Number 8. The Freemasons. Some secret societies are difficult to see through because they may have been smaller than legend claims. The Freemasons are difficult to see through for the opposite reason. They became so widespread, so symbolically rich, and so entangled with modern history that the boundary between what they were, what they are, and what people fear they must be has become almost impossible to draw cleanly. That is what gives them their enduring power. Freemasonry emerged from older traditions tied, at least in part, to stonemason guild culture, and then evolved into a fraternal network centered on ritual, initiation, moral symbolism, secrecy, and brotherhood. By the 18th century, it had become something far larger than a craft inheritance. Lodges spread across Europe and beyond, attracting aristocrats, merchants, officers, thinkers, and political figures. This was not merely a hidden club on the margins of history. It was a structure that placed secrecy directly alongside influence, which is always a dangerous combination for the public imagination. Because when private ritual exists inside public power, suspicion becomes inevitable. The Masons cultivated symbols, degrees, oaths, coded recognition, and ceremonial language that seemed to promise access to inner knowledge. To members, these things could be framed as tools of fraternity, ethical formation, and tradition. To outsiders, they often looked like evidence of concealed agenda. That tension has followed Freemasonry for centuries. The same closed-door practices that create identity inside a group also create mythology outside it. A lodge meeting becomes a hidden council. A symbol becomes proof of invisible reach. A network of mutual recognition becomes a conspiracy waiting to be imagined. And sometimes, to be fair, the suspicion did not emerge from pure fantasy. Freemasons really did include influential people. They really did form networks of trust. They really did operate with private rituals and controlled access. They really did move through the same centuries that saw revolutions, colonial expansion, state formation, and ideological transformation. That does not prove they secretly ruled all of it, but it does explain why their name became magnetically attached to any historical event where unseen coordination felt plausible. Once a brotherhood becomes both private and socially prominent, history starts projecting shadow power onto it almost automatically. That is where the interpretive problem begins. Because Freemasonry is one of those rare cases where dismissing everything as conspiracy is too simple, but accepting the grand myths is equally misleading. The order clearly mattered as a social and symbolic institution. It gave members a language of enlightenment, moral self-fashioning, fraternity, and selective belonging. In some contexts, it may have offered real channels of influence, patronage, and connection. In others, it probably functioned far more as ceremonial social architecture than secret world government. But history hates middle ground. It prefers hidden masters or harmless eccentrics. The Freemasons fit comfortably into neither category. And that unresolved middle is what makes them so hard to see through. They were close enough to power to be feared, but often too fragmented to match the totalizing fantasies built around them. They were private enough to invite obsession, but public enough to survive and expand openly in many places. They were philosophical in presentation, political in suspicion, social in operation, symbolic in style, and historical in consequence. That combination is almost designed to generate centuries of interpretive noise. Then there is the symbolic afterlife. Freemasonry did not remain just an organization. It became a universal shorthand for hidden design. The square and compasses, the all-seeing eye associations people often collapse into Masonic imagery, the temple references, the degrees, the idea of initiated knowledge, all of it made the order into a permanent fixture in modern myth-making. People began seeing Masons everywhere, in architecture, in revolutions, in national founding stories, in elite circles, in signs hidden in plain sight. Once that happens, the organization stops being just itself. It becomes the grammar of secrecy for an entire culture. That is extraordinarily hard to unwind, because from that point on, every real Masonic history has to compete with a much larger imagined Freemasonry, a symbolic empire built from fear, fascination, and projection. The true archive becomes only one layer among many. The Brotherhood's real past exists, but it is constantly wrapped in accusations, romanticism, paranoia, admiration, and anti-Masonic hostility. The result is exactly the kind of historical fog Hidden Archives lives for, a network real enough to matter, secretive enough to distort the record, and famous enough that myth now clings to every surviving symbol. That is why history still cannot fully see through the Freemasons. Not because they are unknowable, but because too many people have needed them to mean too many different things. Moral order, hidden wisdom, elite solidarity, political infiltration, enlightenment fraternity, occult survivals, secret power. The Masons have carried all of those meanings at different times, whether deserved or not. And when one brotherhood becomes a screen for so many anxieties about hidden influence, it stops being merely secret. It becomes structurally mysterious. Number 7. The Thule Society. Some secret groups become famous because they were old, expansive, and socially embedded. The Thule Society remains disturbing for a different reason. It was small, ideologically charged, and historically positioned close enough to catastrophe that even limited influence feels ominous. Founded in post-World War I Germany, the Thule Society emerged from the unstable atmosphere of defeat, humiliation, nationalism, occult speculation, racial mythology, and revolutionary fear that gripped parts of the country after the war. This was not a neutral age for hidden societies. Germany was politically fractured, socially radicalized, and psychologically wounded. In such conditions, private circles built around mythic origin stories, esoteric symbolism, and nationalist vision were more than curiosities. They were pressure chambers for dangerous ideas. That is why the Thule Society still carries such a dark aura. The group mixed folkish nationalism, anti-Semitism, anti-communism, racial mysticism, and occult-inflected mythology into a worldview that treated ancient origins and ethnic destiny as if they were keys to political rebirth. It was not just interested in secrecy for ritual pleasure. Its symbolism was tied to ideology. It looked backward into mythical northern or Aryan pasts in order to justify a radicalized future. This is one of the most sinister uses of secret society culture, when myth, blood, and destiny are fused tightly enough that politics begins to look like spiritual warfare. And in the case of Thule, that atmosphere mattered. The society has long been associated with early circles around German nationalist politics in Munich, including connections to figures and milieus that fed into the early Nazi movement. That fact is central to why history still struggles to see the society clearly. There is an understandable temptation to inflate it into a hidden engine behind Nazism itself, a master occult core directing later terror from the shadows. That makes for powerful storytelling. But the historical truth is more difficult and, in some ways, more unsettling. The group may not have ruled events from behind a curtain, yet it helped cultivate an ideological ecosystem in which certain kinds of extremism could breathe and organize. That kind of influence is harder to dramatize, but more historically plausible. Because not all dangerous brotherhoods need to secretly run the world to matter. Sometimes it is enough that they gather people, legitimize fantasies, radicalize language, connect networks, and convert grievance into mission. The Thule Society appears to have operated in precisely that zone. It did not need perfect secrecy or total control. It only needed to help shape a mental and political atmosphere in which mythic race thinking, conspiratorial hatred, and nationalist violence could feel intellectually or spiritually elevated. That is an extremely dark historical function. And yet the society remains difficult to interpret because legend has wrapped itself around the archive. Later writers, occult enthusiasts, conspiracy theorists, and sensational histories have often enlarged Thule into something almost supernatural, as if the Third Reich itself was simply the political outer shell of some hidden esoteric order. That exaggeration obscures more than it reveals. But it survives because there is just enough genuine darkness in the society's worldview to make the larger myth feel emotionally credible. The record does not support every fantasy. It supports enough to keep the atmosphere poisoned. That is what makes the Thule Society so compelling. It sits at the convergence of two dangerous historical tendencies. First, the use of mythic antiquity and racial pseudo-history to justify political extremism. Second, the tendency of later generations to convert partially secret, partially ideological groups into total explanations for catastrophe. Thule occupies both spaces at once. It was real. It was toxic. It was connected to a broader field of radical right-wing culture in Germany. But the exact scope of its influence remains difficult to fix, because secretive organizations rarely leave behind transparent measurements of what they shaped indirectly. And sometimes indirect influence is the most important kind. A hidden group may never issue the final order, never control the later state, never stand publicly at the center of power, and still matter immensely by helping define the symbolic language through which later movements imagine themselves. The Thule Society appears to have been one of those groups. It helped gather myth, race, fear, and destiny into a coherent atmosphere. It made extremism feel ancient. It gave political hatred the costume of initiation and vision. That is historically consequential even without a hidden master narrative. That is why history still cannot fully see through it. Not because the Thule Society is unknowable, but because its importance lies in a zone historians are always forced to handle carefully. The zone between direct control and ideological incubation. Too much skepticism and you miss how secretive cultures nourish extremism. Too much sensationalism and you turn the group into a myth larger than the evidence. But either way, the darkness remains. Because once a brotherhood helps teach politics to speak in the language of destiny, blood, and hidden truth, the damage does not depend on how many members were in the room. It depends on how far the ideas traveled once they left it. Number 6. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Some secret societies are feared because they may have shaped politics. Others are feared because they seem to promise something even more unstable: access to hidden reality itself. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn belongs to that second category, and that is why its name still carries such an unusual charge. Founded in late 19th century Britain, the Golden Dawn emerged in an era already saturated with spiritual restlessness, imperial confidence, occult revival, and fascination with systems of hidden knowledge. This was a world in which science was transforming modern life, but not extinguishing the hunger for mystery. On the contrary, the more the modern world seemed measurable, the more certain circles longed for deeper architectures of meaning behind the visible surface. Ancient symbols, esoteric correspondences, ritual magic, secret grades of initiation, lost wisdom supposedly preserved across civilizations. The Golden Dawn offered all of it. That made it far more than a harmless club of eccentrics. The order developed an elaborate structure of ceremonies, teachings, symbolic systems, and graded advancement. Drawing from Kabbalah, alchemy, astrology, Egyptian imagery, Rosicrucian legend, tarot, ceremonial magic, and Western esoteric traditions more broadly, it built an intellectual and ritual world that felt at once scholarly, theatrical, and dangerous. To members, it was a path toward initiation, mastery, and transformation. To outsiders, it looked like a secret machine for manufacturing hidden power. That impression only grew stronger because of who passed through it. The Golden Dawn attracted remarkable figures, poets, mystics, writers, occultists, and seekers, whose names would later carry cultural weight far beyond the order itself. W.B. Yeats is the most famous example, but he was far from alone. Once an organization gathers serious artistic minds, public fascination changes. It is no longer easy to dismiss it as fringe fantasy. The question becomes more unsettling. What exactly did these people think they were accessing inside that circle? And how much of what they found followed them back out into literature, art, spirituality, and modern occult culture? That is where the order becomes difficult to fully see through. Because the Golden Dawn was secretive, but not in the same way as political brotherhoods or revolutionary cells. Its secrecy was tied to initiation, symbolism, and layered access to knowledge. That creates a different historical problem. Political influence can sometimes be traced through letters, meetings, and outcomes. Esoteric influence is far harder to measure. It travels through imagination, metaphor, worldview, artistic production, and the transformation of personal identity. A ritual in a closed room may leave no obvious direct consequence, and yet alter the symbolic language of a generation. That possibility matters. The Golden Dawn appears at exactly the point where hidden society becomes culture-making engine. Even after its internal conflicts, splintering, and eventual decline as a unified order, its afterlife proved extraordinary. Its teachings leaked outward. Its symbols survived. Its systems influenced later occult movements, ceremonial magic traditions, modern esotericism, and the broader popular idea that the Western occult world was not merely a pile of scattered superstitions, but a structured body of initiatory knowledge waiting to be unlocked. That is why it still feels larger than the documents alone. History can identify founders, manuscripts, rituals, quarrels, and breakaways, but those things only reveal the scaffolding. What remains harder to see clearly is the interior attraction, the psychological and symbolic force of entering a system that told intelligent, educated adults that reality had hidden layers accessible through discipline, ritual, and initiation. That kind of promise is never historically neutral. It changes how people imagine truth itself. And perhaps that is why the Golden Dawn remains so compelling. It was not a secret society of hidden kings or covert government, not in the usual sense. Its danger was subtler. It helped preserve and modernize the idea that hidden structures of knowledge exist beneath ordinary life, that symbols are technologies, that initiation reveals what public existence cannot. Whether one sees that as spiritual seriousness, elaborate theatre, or dangerous self-mythology, the historical effect is undeniable. The order became one of the great transmission points through which esoteric thought entered modern consciousness, wearing the dignity of system. That is why history still cannot fully see through it. Not because nothing is known, but because too much of what mattered happened in domains the archive handles badly: experience, belief, transformed imagination, inner hierarchy, and the feeling of standing inside a hidden order that claims to know how the world is really built. Once a society begins operating at that level, it becomes hard to measure and impossible to keep contained. The Golden Dawn may not have ruled empires, but it helped shape the symbolic underworld of modernity, and that kind of influence often lasts longer than governments. Number 5. The Hashshashin, some secret brotherhoods, became famous because they cultivated symbols. Others became famous because their enemies made their methods sound almost supernatural. The Hashshashin stand at the center of that kind of historical distortion, half real, half legend, and still powerful because the mixture is so hard to separate. Active during the medieval period in the Middle East, the group most often referred to in the West as the Hashshashin were part of the Nizari Ismaili world, emerging within a landscape already dense with sectarian division, empire, crusade, espionage, fortress politics, and survival under constant threat. This was not a romantic age of hidden daggers moving through fairy tale darkness. It was a brutal geopolitical environment in which smaller communities had to survive among much larger powers, often by unconventional means. That is the reality beneath the myth. The Nizari strongholds, most famously associated with Alamut, developed reputations for strategic assassination of powerful enemies. Those killings were targeted, calculated, and politically meaningful, not random acts of theatrical violence. That detail matters because later legend often turns the group into something simpler and more exotic than they were. In hostile accounts, especially those shaped by crusader and outsider imagination, the Hashshashin became almost archetypal fanatics, drugged killers, secret disciples of a mysterious old man of the mountain, men stripped of ordinary will and programmed for death. It is an unforgettable image. It is also historically contaminated. The very word assassin is often linked in popular imagination to these stories, which only deepens the aura around the group. But the medieval sources surrounding them are tangled with fear, polemic, misunderstanding, and deliberate enemy myth-making. That is what makes the Hashshashin so hard to see clearly. They were real, their strategic killings were real. Their fortresses, leadership, and sectarian identity were real. But the image that survived in broader historical memory, the perfect hidden order of drugged killers obeying an almost demonic master, was built in part by those who had every reason to demonize them. And that demonization was itself historically effective. Because once a secretive minority group becomes feared for precise political violence, rumor begins doing half the work of power. Enemies do not merely fear what the group can physically accomplish. They begin imagining what else it must be capable of. Secrecy amplifies that fear. Distance amplifies it further. Cultural unfamiliarity seals the effect. Soon the organization no longer exists only as a political actor. It becomes a legend of disciplined death moving invisibly through the world. That is where the historical fog becomes most intense. The Nizari Ismailis were not simply a murder cult drifting outside history. They were part of a complex religious and political reality, navigating survival through networks, strongholds, leadership, doctrine, and tactical violence in a world that gave small communities few soft options. But later memory rarely preserves complexity when fear offers a better story. Western retellings especially often stripped away the theological, strategic, and regional context in favor of something more cinematic, the hidden order that turns men into instruments. That story survived because it is almost too powerful to kill. A secret mountain fortress, initiated followers, elite targets, shadow war, absolute obedience, poisoned reputation. It is the blueprint for centuries of fantasy about covert brotherhoods. The Hashshashin became one of the original templates through which later cultures imagined what a secret order might be, disciplined, fanatical, invisible, and terrifyingly patient. Whether or not the details were fair, the symbolic impact was enormous. And that is why history still cannot fully see through them. Not because their existence is in doubt, but because the archive comes to us wrapped in enemy narrative, exoticizing legend, and later romantic invention. Too much skepticism and you risk flattening a real historical organization into pure fiction. Too much credulity and you inherit every medieval nightmare as fact. The truth sits in that unstable middle, a real movement, real strategy, real fear, and a legendary afterlife that became larger than the group's own historical body. That afterlife may be the most revealing part. The Hashshashin helped teach later history that secrecy plus selective violence creates disproportionate symbolic power. A group does not need to dominate armies to dominate imagination. It only needs to move through the minds of its enemies as something unknowable and precise. Once that happens, legend becomes a second weapon, one often stronger than the first. The Hashshashin did not survive in memory because history understood them clearly. They survived because history never entirely did, and that is exactly the kind of brotherhood Hidden Archives was made to follow. Number 4. Skull and Bones. Some secret societies are remembered for ritual, some for ideology, some for revolution. Skull and Bones is more unsettling because it sits at the intersection of secrecy and elite continuity, the place where private initiation and public power begin to overlap so often that the boundary between fraternity and influence stops feeling clean. Founded at Yale in 1832, Skull and Bones is, on paper, a collegiate secret society. That description is technically true, but also deeply insufficient. Plenty of universities have exclusive clubs, closed circles, and traditions of elite belonging. What gives Skull and Bones its particular historical charge is not merely that it is secretive, but that its secrecy is attached to one of America's most important pipelines of establishment power. Its members have included political dynasties, intelligence figures, financiers, lawyers, and men whose later careers placed them close to the core of the American state. That changes the meaning of ritual immediately, because once a private brotherhood repeatedly produces people who move into visible power, the public begins asking a deeper question. What exactly is being formed inside the circle before those men step into national life? Is it merely friendship? Networking? Elite confidence? Or is something stronger being cultivated? A sense of belonging to an inner world, of recognizing one another behind public roles, of carrying private loyalties through institutions that outwardly belong to everyone. That uncertainty is the source of Skull and Bones' enduring mystique. The society is famous for its initiation practices, symbolic theatrics, closed meetings, and the atmosphere surrounding its headquarters, commonly called the tomb. Even the architecture of the group contributes to its legend. It does not look like a playful student club. It looks like a sealed chamber for people being inducted into a different level of social identity. That matters because architecture shapes myth. A windowless building, selective membership, ritualized admission, and silence about the interior create exactly the kind of conditions in which speculation flourishes. And unlike many conspiratorial fantasies, Skull and Bones does not need to be wholly imaginary to feel troubling. Its real existence is enough. The issue is not whether it secretly runs America in some cartoonish sense. The issue is subtler and arguably more serious. Elite fraternities shape people before they govern. They train comportment, confidence, loyalty, exclusion, and the emotional comfort of belonging to a class that expects to move through institutions as if it were born to them. When that training occurs under secrecy, with symbols of death, rebirth, and chosen fraternity wrapped around it, the historical meaning becomes hard to ignore. The society does not need to issue hidden orders to matter. It may matter simply by teaching future power how to recognize itself. That is much harder to measure than direct conspiracy. It lives in tone, access, and habit. The familiarity of names, the ease of movement through political and financial structures. The quiet understanding that certain doors open more naturally for men already initiated into systems of prestige and recognition. That is why Skull and Bones sits in such an unsettling historical space. It is not a revolutionary underground and not merely a harmless tradition. It is a machine of selective belonging operating beside public ideals of openness and merit. And then the symbolic afterlife makes everything darker. Because the name itself, Skull and Bones, is almost too perfect. Death, secrecy, brotherhood, the tomb, all of it sounds like the vocabulary of Gothic fiction. That means every real historical connection to power gets magnified by an atmosphere already primed for suspicion. Once presidents, intelligence officials, and establishment families are linked to a society with that kind of imagery, myth begins feeding on reality almost automatically. The result is a group that may be less omnipotent than its critics fear, but more structurally revealing than its defenders prefer. That is why history still cannot fully see through it. Not because there is no evidence, but because the most meaningful effects of elite secret societies are rarely written down as conspiracies. They are encoded in networks, habits, and the pre-political shaping of people who later speak the language of public service while carrying private formation into the room with them. Skull and Bones exists in exactly that zone where social ritual becomes historical significance without ever needing to announce itself. And perhaps that is what makes it so American in the darkest sense. A republic that claims openness, an elite pipeline that practices enclosure, a culture of public competition shadowed by private initiation. Skull and Bones remains compelling not because it gives us a single hidden answer, but because it embodies a question modern democracies never fully solve. How much of public power is prepared in private rooms no one else was meant to enter? Number 3. The Bavarian Illuminati. Some secret societies become legendary because they were ancient. The Bavarian Illuminati became legendary because they were brief, modern, and perfectly timed to become larger in myth than they ever were in life. Founded in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt in Bavaria, the Illuminati were, in historical terms, a relatively short-lived secret society rooted in Enlightenment-era goals. The group opposed superstition, clerical domination, and certain forms of political oppression. It sought to gather educated men into a network shaped by reason, reform, discipline, and influence. At its core, it was not originally the supernatural empire later imagination would build around it. It was a product of a very real 18th century world, a world of censorship, intellectual ambition, private association, and the desire to reshape society through hidden organization when open reform was difficult or dangerous. That alone would already make it interesting. But what transformed the Illuminati from a historical society into a permanent cultural ghost was the collision between its secrecy and the age in which it appeared. The late 18th century was already vibrating with anxiety, revolution, anti-clericalism, elite panic, and suspicion that unseen forces were helping reorder the world. In such an atmosphere, any secretive reformist network risked becoming larger than itself the moment public fear got hold of it. And public fear did get hold of it. The Bavarian authorities suppressed the society. Documents were seized, membership was attacked, the organization fractured and disappeared in practical terms. Under normal historical conditions, that might have been the end of the story, one more clandestine experiment extinguished by the state. But secrecy has a special afterlife once an organization is forcibly exposed. Its documents look incriminating. Its hidden structure feels ominous. Its suppression appears to confirm significance. And when the broader world is already unstable, people begin asking whether the visible group was only part of something much larger. That is the point at which the Illuminati escaped history and entered mythology, because from there it became available for endless reuse. The French Revolution, modern banking, anti-religious plots, elite coordination, global manipulation, revolutionary upheaval, cultural engineering, almost any event that seemed too large, too chaotic, or too unsettling to explain comfortably could be linked back, somehow, to the Illuminati. The group became a master symbol of hidden design. Once that happened, the real Bavarian society was no longer enough. It had to compete with an imagined Illuminati so vast and adaptable that it could inhabit every age without ever needing direct proof. That symbolic expansion is historically extraordinary. Most secret societies are eventually pinned down by scale. They turn out to have been too small, too local, too fragmented, or too ordinary to sustain larger fantasies. The Illuminati did something different. They became a universal grammar for suspicion. They offered the perfect template: hidden initiates, rationalized hierarchy, elite recruitment, inner grades, concealed intentions, and a political world already nervous enough to believe that behind public events there must be some colder intelligence directing the pattern. That is why they remain so difficult to fully see through. Not because the original group is entirely mysterious. Historians can identify Weishaupt, trace the organization's goals, examine documents, and place the society inside its proper Bavarian and Enlightenment context. The real challenge is that this historical Illuminati now exists under the weight of an enormous counterfeit afterlife. Every serious history of the order must fight against 2.5 centuries of inflation, paranoia, anti-modern anxiety, and popular culture. The archive is real. The myth is stronger, and perhaps that is the most revealing part. The Bavarian Illuminati matter not because they secretly ruled the modern world, but because they helped create the possibility that modernity itself could always be imagined as secretly ruled. That is a much deeper historical consequence. The order became the prototype of invisible coordination in a mass age, a hidden elite, a hidden script, a hidden hand. Once the Illuminati occupied that role in the imagination, every future crisis gained a ready-made explanation waiting in the dark. That makes them far more than a failed secret society. They are one of history's greatest engines of conspiratorial structure, a group real enough to exist, small enough to vanish, and symbolically perfect enough to become immortal. That is why history still cannot fully see through the Bavarian Illuminati. Because long after the actual society disappeared, the idea of it kept growing, adapting, and entering every chamber where modern people fear that power has become too hidden to name. And once a secret brotherhood becomes an idea that can explain everything, it stops belonging only to the past. It becomes one of the permanent shadows cast across the present. Number 2. The Rosicrucians. Some secret societies are feared because they may have wielded direct power. Others are feared because they seem to promise something more destabilizing than power itself, a hidden order of knowledge moving quietly beneath the visible world. The Rosicrucians belong to that second category, and that is exactly why they remain so difficult to see through. They entered European consciousness in the early 17th century through a series of mysterious manifestos, texts that described a secret brotherhood devoted to wisdom, reform, and hidden learning. These writings spoke of Christian Rosenkreuz, an almost mythic founder figure, and of a fraternity possessing deep spiritual and philosophical knowledge gathered from long journeys, ancient traditions, and initiatory insight. If taken literally, the manifestos seem to announce the existence of a concealed order of enlightened men working invisibly for the transformation of religion, science, and society. That was a dangerous idea to release into Europe at that moment, because the continent was already living through tension, religious fracture, intellectual upheaval, and the unstable dawn of what would later become modern scientific thought. Old certainties were weakening. New systems of knowledge were emerging. Print culture was accelerating the spread of ideas faster than institutions could comfortably control them. In such a world, the suggestion that a hidden brotherhood already existed, already understood the deeper structure of reality, and was quietly guiding renewal from behind the veil, was almost guaranteed to provoke fascination. And fascination arrived immediately. Scholars, mystics, alchemists, theologians, seekers, and opportunists all responded. Some tried to contact the supposed fraternity. Some denounced it. Some absorbed its symbolism into their own work. Some treated it as allegory, others as real organization, and still others as a coded call to spiritual or intellectual awakening. That ambiguity is central to why the Rosicrucians became so historically powerful. They never sat still in one category. Were they an actual hidden order? A literary fiction? A spiritual manifesto disguised as an announcement? A symbolic invitation for a new elite of knowledge to imagine itself into existence? No answer has ever fully erased the others. That is what makes the Rosicrucians so compelling. Unlike a secret society with clearly documented membership roles and traceable chains of command, Rosicrucianism exists at the threshold where text becomes possibility. The manifestos may have described an order that was never institutionally real in the straightforward sense, but that did not prevent the idea from becoming historically active. On the contrary, it may have made it stronger. A vague secret brotherhood can be inhabited by imagination far more easily than a fixed bureaucracy, and imagination is often where real influence begins. The Rosicrucian idea helped feed a broader European culture of esotericism, reformist longing, occult philosophy, and hidden wisdom traditions. It became part of the symbolic bloodstream from which later groups, later rituals, and later systems of initiatory thought would draw. Even if the original fraternity was more text than institution, the afterlife of the concept was immense. People began thinking differently because the brotherhood might exist. They wrote differently, searched differently, formed circles differently, interpreted hidden meaning differently. The invisible order became historically real by acting on minds. That is one of the strangest forms of influence any secret society can possess. The Rosicrucians may not have ruled states or openly directed revolutions, but they occupied a subtler and, in some ways, deeper level of power. They helped normalize the belief that beneath public religion, beneath official knowledge, beneath conventional learning, there might be a more complete inner architecture accessible only to the initiated. That belief has echoed through centuries of occultism, alternative spirituality, secret order culture, and modern fascination with hidden masters. And that is why history still cannot fully see through them. Not because nothing is known, but because what is known never quite resolves the central question. If the Rosicrucians were only a literary invention, why did they shape so much real esoteric culture afterward? If they were real, where exactly were they? How were they structured? And why do they always seem to retreat just as the archive tries to pin them down? They remain suspended between manifesto and movement, allegory and brotherhood, fiction and force. That suspension is their real power. Because once a secret society becomes inseparable from the possibility that hidden knowledge itself is out there waiting, it stops being merely historical. It becomes archetypal. And archetypal brotherhoods are among the hardest things history has ever tried to expose. Number 1. The Knights Templar. Some brotherhoods become mysterious because too little survives of them. The Knights Templar became mysterious because too much collided inside them at once. War, wealth, oath, sanctity, banking, secrecy, sudden destruction, accusation, silence. Few organizations in history were better designed to become permanent inhabitants of the shadow world between fact and legend. Founded in the early 12th century in the aftermath of the First Crusade, the Templars began as a military religious order charged with protecting pilgrims in the Holy Land. That mission already made them unusual. They were monks but armed. They were warriors but bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They occupied a category that seemed almost contradictory, a disciplined religious brotherhood fused to organized violence. In a medieval world where spiritual authority and martial power were already deeply intertwined, the Templars nonetheless felt like something more concentrated, more intense, a sacred war machine operating under holy legitimacy. That alone would have made them unforgettable. But the order did not remain only a battlefield fraternity. Over time, the Templars accumulated land, influence, administrative reach, and financial sophistication across Europe and the Mediterranean world. They became one of the most powerful transnational institutions of their age. Kings dealt with them, nobles trusted them, wealth moved through them, fortresses, commanderies, treasure, legal privileges, papal protection, and international networks all gathered around their name. This is the moment where the Templars became historically dangerous in the purest sense, because secrecy inside holiness is powerful, but secrecy inside holiness plus money is explosive. And then came the fall. In 1307, under King Philip IV of France, the Templars were arrested, accused of heresy, corruption, blasphemy, obscene rites, and hidden crimes committed within initiation ceremonies and private order life. Torture, confession, political maneuvering, royal pressure, papal weakness, and eventual dissolution followed. The leadership was destroyed. The order was broken. But what matters most for their afterlife is the shape of that destruction. They did not fade gradually. They were struck down under charges so dramatic, so secretive, and so morally contaminating that later generations could never resist asking whether some hidden truth had died with them. That is the engine of the legend. Because once a rich, armed, transnational brotherhood with private rituals is suddenly crushed by the state under accusations of concealed sacrilege, history almost cannot help turning the case into permanent myth. Were the charges false, inventions produced by greed and political need? Very likely in broad outline. Were their internal rituals misunderstood or weaponized by enemies? Possibly. Did the order hide treasure, secret doctrine, esoteric knowledge, escape networks? These are the questions that multiplied in the vacuum left behind by its destruction. And the more suddenly the Templars disappeared as a functioning power, the larger they became as symbolic residue. That residue spread everywhere. The Templars have been recast as guardians of holy relics, keepers of forbidden knowledge, lost bankers of medieval Europe, hidden survivors within later secret societies, custodians of the Grail, transmitters of esoteric tradition, and martyrs of state persecution. Most of these claims outrun what the evidence can support. But that is precisely the point. The order became too symbolically rich to remain confined to the archive. Once an institution embodies martial sanctity, concentrated wealth, secrecy, and a violent suppression, it becomes irresistible to every culture looking for a hidden continuity beneath official history. And unlike many secret societies, the Templars were unquestionably real at immense scale. That fact makes the mystery harder, not easier. A purely invented brotherhood can eventually be dismissed. The Templars cannot. Their castles were real, their money was real, their exemptions were real, their enemies were real, their destruction was real. All of that gives later myth an unusually solid body to inhabit. The legends feel plausible because they attach themselves to a structure that actually mattered. History knows the order existed, knows it grew powerful, knows it was obliterated. What history cannot fully recover is the emotional and institutional interior of that world before the fall, the exact private meaning of its brotherhood, the degree to which its enemies distorted it, and the full reason it still exerts such pressure on the imagination. That is why the Knights Templar deserve the #1 position. They are the perfect hidden archive society because they stand at the crossing point of every element that makes secrecy historically immortal. Sacred mission, initiated brotherhood, elite trust, wealth, political threat, sudden persecution, documentary gaps, mythic afterlife. They are not merely a secret order. They are the template through which later centuries learned to imagine what secret orders are. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. The Templars do not remain powerful only because of what they once did. They remain powerful because every later age keeps needing them to conceal something. Treasure, knowledge, survival, a hidden chain of influence running under official history. That is why history still cannot fully see through the Knights Templar, because the moment they were destroyed, they stopped being only an order. They became a permanent chamber of unanswered possibility.